Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. A millionaire blackmailed a poor boy to humiliate him, but froze when he heard the first sound. In the sprawling city of Chicago, punctuated by the roar of the metro and distant sirens, nestled in the heart of a working-class neighborhood with tired buildings, lived Elijah Carter, a 16-year-old boy with a precocious maturity, sculpted by the harshness of life. The walls of his neighborhood were covered in graffiti that screamed anger, identity, and survival. The streets smelled of hot concrete in the summer, of salt and loneliness in the winter. There, amidst the din and muffled dreams, Elijah moved forward each day with an almost sacred discretion, as if he didn't want to disturb the surrounding pain. Orphaned by his father since the age of 6, Elijah had few memories of him. A deep voice that sang him lullabies, calloused hands that taught him the basic chords on an old acoustic guitar, and that gentle look that seemed to say, "Even if the world is hard, music is your refuge." His father, Marcus Carter, was a dock worker. A brutal accident had taken him away one foggy morning, leaving behind a broken wife and a child too young to understand what death truly was. Since that day, his mother, Grace Carter, carried the weight of the household alone. A dignified woman, exhausted but proud, she cleaned offices at dawn, served coffee in a diner during the day, and cleaned houses in the evening. She often came home late, her feet swollen, her hands red from the products, but never without a smile for Elijah. She believed in him, more than in herself, and every note he played was a way of saying thank you. Every song, a whisper to ease his silences. Elijah lived in a small apartment on the 4th floor of a walk-up building. The walls were paper-thin, and the neighbors were noisy, but in his tiny room, he had created a sanctuary. A few books, song lyrics written on crumpled paper, and most importantly, his guitar. This guitar was that of his grandfather, a jazz musician who once played in the smoky clubs of Bronzeville. It was an instrument marked by time. The wood bore scars, the strings creaked slightly, but as soon as Elijah laid his fingers on it, it was reborn. Every day after school, Elijah would walk through the subway corridors. He often chose the Roosevelt station, where the streams of workers, students, and dreamers in a hurry converged. He would sit down against a pillar, open his case, and begin to play. He didn't play for money, though he needed it, but to free something. His voice, warm and sincere, carried the memory of his neighborhood, of children who no longer saw their fathers come home, of exhausted mothers, of vanished promises. He sang of silent tears, invisible struggles, and the stubborn hope of those the city had forgotten. And sometimes, even in the tumult of the subway, people stopped. Sometimes a tear would fall, sometimes a hand would place a crumpled bill. Sometimes even a child would dance. But above all, Elijah saw something change in the eyes of those who listened to him. A flash of light, fleeting but real. He was just a boy with a worn-out guitar, but in those moments, he felt like he was truly alive. Like he was seen, like he was heard, and above all, like he was giving a voice to those who were never heard. One evening, as the shadows lengthened on the frozen sidewalks of Chicago, a sharp November wind swept through the city, rushing between the skyscrapers like a biting reminder of the approaching winter. The tired street lamps cast a pale light on the gray sidewalks. In this almost hostile cold, Elijah Carter had settled into his usual place, just outside the station Jackson, not far from the business district. Everything around him shone. Glass towers reflected luxury stores, black cars with tinted windows drove by, and men in three-piece suits emerged from offices, their ears glued to their phones, discussing figures and contracts. In this world of luxury and concrete, Elijah stood out. His fingers, reddened by the cold, gripped his guitar like a lifeline. He sat on an old folding stool, placed his open guitar case in front of him, and quickly tuned his instrument despite the tired strings. He had chosen this place not for the generous rooms, but because the contrasts there were the most violent. He wanted the powerful to hear the voice of the invisible, even if they were unaware of it. That evening, among the hurried silhouettes, a man slowed his pace. Robert Sinclair, 54, wore a long black cashmere coat, a Swiss watch on his wrist, and shoes as shiny as his buildings. The CEO of a financial empire, Robert embodied everything the elite admired and the poor neighborhoods feared: cold power, voracious ambition, open contempt. He had just left a business cocktail party where he had signed a multi-million-dollar contract for a real estate deal that, ironically, would raise a former working-class neighborhood to build a new luxury complex. The kind of decision that cost him neither sleep nor conscience. When his eyes met Elijah's frail figure, concentrating on his guitar, a cynical thought crossed his mind. This kid represents everything I hate about weak people. The illusion that art or passion can compete with money. He stopped in front of him, hands in his pockets, a smirk on his lips. He watched the boy in silence for a few seconds, then slowly approached. "Do you really think your little song is worth anything in this world?" he said, his voice sharp as a blade. Elijah looked up, surprised by the interruption. Before him stood a richly dressed man, his gaze piercing and devoid of any warmth. "I can buy your guitar for $50. That's more than it's worth, isn't it?" Robert continued, his smile fixed, almost cruel. "Or better yet, if you refuse, I can film you playing and show it to my associates as an example of a lost dreamer. You know, a little grotesque diversion between two glasses of champagne." A tense silence fell. Around them, a few passers-by stopped, intrigued. Elijah, initially taken aback, felt a surge of anger rise in his throat. But he took a deep breath and pushed it back. He knew that responding with hatred would only fuel the humiliation this man wanted to provoke. He gently placed his hand back on his guitar, looked up at Robert, and replied in a calm but assured voice. "My guitar is not for sale. It is not made of wood and strings alone. It contains my father's voice, my mother's tears, and all the mornings I had to choose music over fear. It is my story, my only hope, and it is not something you can buy, sir." His gaze didn't waver. He didn't plead. He affirmed. Robert, still amused by Elijah's response, shrugged theatrically, as if he were watching a circus act. "Well, this is getting entertaining," he muttered aloud to himself, activating the camera on his high-tech phone. He held the screen up prominently, framing Elijah's face behind the lens. "Sing for me, kid. Show them what you can do. Or would you rather I say you're begging?" Around them, the cold seemed to intensify. The wind whistled between the concrete and glass columns, carrying the echoes of horns and hurried voices. But in the urban tumult, an ominous silence fell. Elijah didn't respond. He simply closed his eyes for a second. One breath. Just one. Then he slowly placed his fingers on the worn strings of his guitar, caressing the worn wood with the reverence of a believer touching a sacred altar. He strummed the strings not to impress, but to survive, to remind himself that he existed. The very first note escaped like a whisper from the heart, deep, suspended in the icy air, and at that precise moment, everything stopped. The hubbub of the city grew distant. Conversations became muffled echoes. Even the wind seemed to kneel. Then Elijah's voice spoke. Not a perfect voice, not polished by the lessons of a conservatory or the filters of a studio. A voice drew, marked by the tears we swallow, by the nights without dinner, by the goodbyes we never got to say. Every word, every note, vibrated with a naked truth: poverty, love, loss, struggle. Elijah didn't sing to entertain. He testified. "She worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, and I wore shoes that didn't fit. But in his eyes I saw a kingdom, where love was worth more than all profits." Passers-by began to slow down. A man in a suit stopped abruptly, briefcase in hand. A woman in high heels, phone pressed to her ear, slowly lowered her arm, mouth slightly open. A teenager in a hoodie approached, his headphones removed so he could hear Elijah with his own ears. Soon, about 30 people formed a semicircle. Some looked at each other without daring to speak. Others let their tears flow, silently. They didn't know why, but something, in that voice, concerned them all. And Robert? He was still holding his phone, but his hand was shaking slightly. The image on the screen was blurry. He had wanted to record a mockery, a viral moment, to share between 2 glasses of whiskey. But what he was filming was too pure, too strong, too disturbing. He felt something crack inside him, a piece of the wall he had erected between himself and the real world. This kid he thought he was making a fool of had just reflected back to him, like a crude mirror, the emptiness of his golden existence. Elijah sang his truth, but it seemed to be addressed to his. Has his emptiness. He slowly lowered his phone, without even realizing it. A lump had risen in his throat, foreign, unwanted. Shame? Emotion? Regret? He didn't know, but he could no longer bear that gaze, or that voice. He felt little. Around him, no one spoke. Everyone listened. And Elijah, his eyes half closed, looked at no one. He was elsewhere, in communion with his missing father, his struggling mother, his forgotten neighborhood. He sang for the absent, for the invisible, for those who were never filmed. When the last note died away, it resonated like a beat suspended in the silence. A collective breath seemed to have stopped. The wind itself had fallen silent. Around Elijah, the crowd remained frozen, as if everyone feared that a word, a gesture, would break the fragile magic of this suspended moment. Then, like a murmur that had become a tide, a spontaneous ovation burst out. Sincere, deep applause, sometimes mixed with tears, rose up in the cold of the night. Elijah, his cheeks flushed with wind and emotion, gently lowered his guitar, his eyes bright but calm. He didn't make any dramatic gestures. He didn't thank you with words. He simply smiled humbly, to place a hand on his heart and bow, head bowed, as one bows before a shared truth. At that precise moment, he was no longer a poor teenager playing in the subway. He was a megaphone and witness, an artist. In the crowd, a man had stopped applauding. He stood motionless, his eyes blank and his arms at his sides. Robert Sinclair. He had it all. A fortune estimated at hundreds of millions, a financial empire, properties in 3 countries, an enviable address book. And yet, at that moment, he felt poor. Not money, but meaning. This kid had just, with a few chords and simple lyrics, demolished the wall of his arrogance. A song was enough to awaken in him a buried discomfort, an old malaise that he had learned to silence under numbers and power. He turned and walked away silently, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his phone still in his hand, screen black. A few minutes later, as the crowd slowly dispersed, a man approached Elijah. He wore a wool scarf, a leather notebook under his arm, and a piercing gaze. "Hi, my name is Mark Thompson. I am a producer at Liberty Sound Records, and I think what you just did is one of the truest things I've ever heard." Elijah was silent for a moment, suspicious. People had promised a lot before, only to disappear. Mark, sensing the hesitation, pulled out a business card. "I don't want to steal anything from you. I just want to help you make it heard. Not format it. Not sell it. Share your story, your voice. They deserve to be heard. By the whole world." And so began a turning point. In a few weeks, Elijah recorded his first studio album, with musicians who, like him, came from the streets, from homes, from the margins. The title? Raw Light, Raw Light. The media picked up his story, a young prodigy from the streets of Chicago, subtitles Rolling Stone. A Voice for the Forgotten, wrote the New York Times. Sun Premier's single, Home Without Walls, became an anthem for young people from the country's forgotten neighborhoods. Teachers used it in class. Single mothers listened to it in silence in their cars. And Robert? He followed everything, from the shadows. Every radio broadcast, every interview, every music video. This boy he had wanted to humiliate was becoming a national symbol of resilience. One night, unable to look at himself in a mirror, Robert wrote a letter. Not a cold message dictated by an assistant. A handwritten letter. 3 trembling pages. "Elijah, that night, I thought I was superior because I was rich. In reality, I was poor in spirit. Your music brought me face to face with a man I had been running away from for years, myself. I'd like to meet you, not to fix anything, to learn. And if you allow me, I would like to put my resources at the service of those I have ignored for so long." A few days later, Elijah agreed to the meeting, not out of naivety, but out of choice of forgiveness. Together, they created the Carter Fund, a foundation to fund instruments, community studios, and scholarships for young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds. Robert never put his name to it. He preferred to stay in the shadows, for once. Elijah, himself, became much more than a singer. He became a lighthouse, a voice that crossed social and racial walls. A reminder that the human dignity does not depend on the clothes we wear or the neighborhood where we were born. That sometimes, just one song can't repair what money can never buy back.